Welcome to We're Not Wizards. We are the best, but not wizards. Enjoy the show!
Welcome to another episode of We're Not Wizards. My name's Richard. I'll be your host for October. Almost said September. I'm so used to being September, but we're right in October into the spooky season. And we're just going to get straight into it. I was going to do a big, huge intro, but I'm going to say two words and two words only, and it's Resident Evil. Because joining me, he's like I don't know if he's like almost like a part-time presenter now. He's been on so many times. It's Mr. Sherwin Matthews from Steamforged Games, and we're going to talk a bit about Resident Evil, which every time you say the word Resident Evil, you have to say it in that voice, otherwise it doesn't count. But anyway, we'll get past the nonsense anyway. How are you, sir? Are you well?
I'm at least reasonable, thank you. Thank you for having me. I always look forward to these shows.
It's decided.
You're at least my second or third favourite podcast.
It's decidedly average to be here. As in,
well, yeah, something along those lines. I could blow smoke up your ass.
I don't know. I don't get that at all. So I wouldn't know how to deal with it if somebody did actually do that. I'd be like that. I don't know.
Do you want me to try and be super enthusiastic? Would that be fun?
No, because it's kind of like it's Sunday evening, so my super enthusiasm I'm building up for when I'm winning tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock at work, the kind of the next day. So okay. So let's talk about a couple of things first of all. The last time that we spoke a little while ago, we were talking about Sea of Thieves.
Okay.
That's kind of been out there, and it's been kicking about the castle. And you're able to obviously talk a little bit more. I think you were kind of a bit restricted in what you couldn't say about it the last time. And the other thing, Mr. I dropped major hints in the podcast and I didn't realise until afterwards, is this announcement of the Horizon Zero Forbidden West game, which you dropped a massive clanger when I was on the show and Sam was on the show.
I will say I like the way you think it was a clanger.
Well, it was like a pretty big, subtle...
Yeah, it was very intentional.
Very, very intentional. Is this just to encourage people to kind of go back and listen to the previous kind of episodes now? So they can
This was mostly because I value your show so much that I wanted to give you a world exclusive. And I gave it to you, and you knew it. You knew exactly what it was, because as soon as we finished the show in the post recording,
yes.
You said you just spoiled that, didn't you? And the exact answer was yeah, I did.
Yes, you did. But then I didn't know if I could actually say anything about it because I didn't want to incur the wrath of the Steamforged kind of marketing department.
You totally couldn't say anything about it, but that's part of the fun, right?
Yeah,
I'll take the flak.
Yeah,
you just get the cool show.
Yeah, it was almost like that situation where you're back to being young again, and then you tell your parents that you no longer believe in Santa Claus anymore, and they're like, oh, but you've got to pretend you kind of believe for your little brother and your other siblings. Basically, you've got to keep the magic kind of alive. So I felt I had to kind of like not let it out of the bag. Otherwise, again, the marketing department from Steamforged Games, who I'm turning into some kind of big, huge monster, which I'm sure they're not. I'm sure they're definitely.
Joe, knowing the personnel involved, me dropping Horizon would give them kittens. You describing them as a monster is probably more likely to get them very upset. So hey ho, it is what it is.
I didn't mean that by any sense. I didn't mean that by any kind of thing at all. Okay, where are we in terms of Horizon Forbidden West then? Putting Sea of Thieves to one side. Are you...
I like the way we start off saying we're going to talk about these two things, and then we just completely ignore that and go straight on a different tangent.
Right, welcome to the show.
Horizon's really, really good. Depending on when you're putting this out, we have either really begun to start putting out blogs and developer diaries and all sorts of things, or that's forthcoming, and we'll be starting in a couple of days or so. But yeah, it's I'm really, really, really excited about the project. It's going to be super fun. What's really cool about this one is, I mean, we always work very closely with all of our licensed partners, but Guerrilla are really special to work with because not only do they have the same massive passion for their game that I would expect, they're really excited about this actually having a canonical story. This is something where this isn't just a reimagining of the Forbidden West board game, video game, or it's not kind of that slightly awkward thing that happens when they make video games of movies, for example, where it's emulation. This is something where this is a whole new story within the Horizon universe, which is canon. There are some things which will have nods here. Well, in fact, there's definitely things in here that have nods to the actual story content that you've seen already, which is really cool. So,
does it then give you a bit more carte blanche in terms of how you approach the entire campaign? I guess because you've been given a kind of you've been given the ability to work with them and say, okay, well, what's going to happen with this? What's going to happen with that? Because this is the tale. This is basically set in the period before Aloy travels to the West, or the Forbidden West as it's called, and it's kind of like the story of how the various kind of factions kind of ended up kind of trying to work together, and then ended up ultimately kind of being at war, as far as I'm aware. So did that give you a little bit more? Well, how are we going to represent this in a kind of a board game kind of format?
Yes, in a roundabout way. I mean, the honest answer to that is this is something where I've forgotten how many there've been, because there's been an awful lot of them. Sit down meetings with Guerrilla of their narrative team. How do we tell it? Let's tell a really cool story. Kind of this is the time period. Lots of conversations about that. Ideas about what could happen within this. That's an interesting story to tell. What do we want to achieve with this? Kind of what are the key beats, all the stuff you'd normally expect. And I think because one of the things that and what's come out of that is we're telling a story that doesn't exactly feel rooted as in this is a board game story or this is a video game story. This is just the world story. So the answer is yes in a roundabout way, but I wouldn't necessarily want to say we've been working in such an integrated way. I honestly couldn't say whether it's something where we've kind of really just run with ideas versus there's been lots of iterative work between the two, their creative department, their narrative team, and us. So, and in fact, it's still ongoing, of course.
So it looks like it's going to follow a similar system to what's been developed for Elden Ring, in that it looks like there's a more exploration style element. Well, Elden Ring, what you've got is you've got obviously the various areas that you can kind of explore, and then when you get to certain areas, when you're doing kind of like it breaks it down, it almost like zooms in when you've kind of got interaction with like bad guys and stuff like that. So is it going to be similar to that, or are you saying, well, we can take, again, we're changing it enough so it doesn't look like we've just hit Control-C, Control-V on the Elden Ring kind of design document?
I would actually say it's nothing like Elden Ring.
Oh.
I mean, obviously, in the grand sense of there's exploration, there's fighting, and so on. And that's probably about where the comparisons end. This is very much an evolution of the Horizon Zero Dawn board game.
Ah, okay.
As you'd expect.
Yes. Yeah.
So definitely not a Control-C, Control-V. We don't really ever do that anyway. The only times that we create engines which are obviously based or influenced by existing engines when we're making the sequel for an existing game. Take the Resident Evil range. Resident Evil.
That's it.
Range, or in this case Horizon. So obviously Horizon has an extremely well-regarded engine in terms of the actual combat and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's the starting point really for what it is. And obviously some of our stuff we want to obviously make sure there's backwards compatibility or forwards compatibility as well, which is built into this.
So in terms of the exploration, how different is it? As in, is it going to be? Are you going to be exploring kind of large areas of the land and things like that in the Forbidden West game?
I'm going to leave a lot of this to Fraser. I don't want to steal his thunder, because this is something where Fraser's going to be talking about this in the next little bit. What I will say is this is a very different method of exploration and exposition than what you would expect from Horizon Zero Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
It's also different to what you had in Elden Ring, so yeah, it's entirely new.
And with that in mind, with you having this new system, is there an opportunity then to create retrofit content for the original Horizon Zero Dawn board game, where you can
watch this space? Yes, but
okay,
yes.
All right, okay.
But I'm not saying anything more than yes.
Right.
And I'll leave you to do that.
Right. Okay. So I mean, I'm going to take that. I'm going to kind of take that as it is. Resident Evil. It's out. It's loud.
Yes.
It's proud, and everything like that.
Don't be too loud. The zombies will hear you.
Why was the decision to not do the Resident Evil game as the first one? Why are you doing it in a kind of like a Star Wars thing?
So let's. I see where you're coming from with that. So let's go back 1,000 years to when I was young,
right?
And we were working on the first Resident Evil,
yeah.
And so we got the gig and we started working on Resident Evil. And Capcom said, "Hey, we're releasing Resident Evil 2 remake. You should make the game based on that. Lots of hype around it. Lots of people really, really excited about it. Let's do that."
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And of course, at this point, there were no details. They just literally announced it at that point.
Yeah.
So we started making Resident Evil 2 based on that, and of course that came out literally more or less the same week as the actual remake. We couldn't have accidentally timed it better if we tried. So that was the thing that landed. And then we started working on Resident Evil, and this was the fun part. I actually started working on Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 3 at the same time. Because I wasn't sure which one we were going to do next, because logically, exactly as you say, why don't we make Resident Evil 1?
Yeah.
And that's the bit where Capcom said, "Hey, we're remaking Resident Evil 3. You should totally release a game based on Resident Evil 3.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, that's what we did. And that game came out pretty well around about the time of Resident Evil 3. So then that's that. And then it happened to naturally fall into our laps. Cool. So now I'm going to go back, pick up the Resident Evil 1 I was working on.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that was the year of the 25th anniversary of the original Resident Evil. So at that point, that fell pretty nicely. It became a celebration of everything Resident Evil.
Yeah.
And life is good.
So was the pressure a little bit off? I'm guessing if it's a year of the celebration, then you've got like a bigger window when you kind of want to get it finished and released, as opposed to let's release it around the board game.
No, I don't think we never really had any focus around we need to try and release our game at the same time as the video game or thereabouts. It just so happens that that's pretty much when it landed on both the other two, to be honest. I mean, Resident Evil 2 was very close. Resident Evil 3, I think, was about 2 or 3 months removed. Resident Evil 3 was about 2 or 3 months removed. But yeah, I've never... Obviously, we have our own internal schedules that we work to for different bits and pieces. I've never really felt any pressure beyond production people shouting at me as much as anything else to hit a certain release date for Resident Evil games.
So in terms, you said you were developing it along the same time as Resident Evil 3. So is it pretty much the kind of the same game, or were you conscious in making changes so it did emulate as close to the first game? Because the thing about the first game is that when you're playing the first game, a zombie takes like 6 bullets to knock down, whereas generally you start off the game with like 5 bullets, so you've not actually got enough bullets to kind of like kill the zombie. Whereas when I was playing kind of like, say, the Resident Evil 3 board game, ammunition and stuff is kind of scarce, but you can be a little bit more gung-ho if you want to be. So when it came to the Resident Evil board game, did you have to then strip that back to make you as a much more kind of vulnerable player with resources being an awful lot tighter?
So there's a couple of answers, and there's always a longer story to this. So Resident Evil has always been an engine where for the first game, i.e. RE2, we developed what we call internally we call the survival horror engine. And that was always something where that's our template. And then when it came to 1/3 development, we started looking at the refinements we want to make to that in terms of how enemies react was a principal one. We wanted to introduce a better or stronger special attack system, an evolution in terms of how can we look at various different functions of the game, streamline things or tidy bits up here and there, that sort of stuff. And of course, when we actually made the decision to work on Resident Evil 3, the work I'd done on Resident Evil 1 went into the hopper for the time being.
Yeah.
That wasn't something where, it was kind of, okay, this is great, but we're RE3, this is the one it is, so this can go sit over here for the moment. So all of the Resident Evil games have been evolution of that same engine. Effectively, it's been something where we're emulating the same feeling with a different location, and exactly as you suggested, it's about where do you zoom in, what typifies this particular game. So for RE3, the big change we wanted to have is this sense of, RE3 does a very good job of putting you in a big city and feeling like you're exploring there.
Yeah.
Now, in reality, it's actually a bunch of rooms. If you were to actually look at the map and understand how it works, it's rooms, but they do obviously this with rendered backgrounds. They make it feel more like city streets and open up, and they don't have regular shapes and so on. Most of them are corridors. So it kind of gives you this bigger sense and this wider range. So that's what we wanted to do with our game, was go, let's make an open world board game. Something nice and simple and not terribly terrifying, as a concept whatsoever.
Yeah.
And we wanted to build that. For this one, we wanted to zoom it back in. One of the big things I remember from the original Resident Evil in the mansion is you don't know what's waiting around the next corner.
Yes.
And one of the big elements we wanted to do with that, and it's something I talked with Matt about for RE3 but never implemented, was the idea of let's set up the map as we go. And in this one, I want to come back to that. And really, that's one of the biggest elements to this was introduce this idea of let's set up the map as we go. One, because it streamlines down setup time, which is something I always wanted to look at doing, and what drove that decision conversation with RE3, but also something where actually as we started playtesting, it became relevant of this has got a whole new life of its own, or unlife, depending on how you look at it. But it's got this whole new life of its own. It's taken on this whole new spirit to what the game is, because the anecdotal story I always tell is Steve, the developer, and I were playing this, playtesting one of the scenarios, one of the later ones, and we're playing it and we're going through, and I'm looking at the tension deck and it's going on and so on, and suddenly it dawned upon me, we're going to run out of cards. We're going to fail this scenario because we don't actually, because we need to read cards. Where's the typewriter? Oh, we haven't found it yet.
Yeah.
And suddenly Steve and I immediately, it's quite funny, both of us clicked well out of playtesting mode and gamer mode kicked in. And now we're like, right, eyes down, eyes on the prize, let's find the typewriter so we don't die. And we just both had the same reaction. It's quite funny. And then we just ran around, found the typewriter, just started running off the map to explore, found the typewriter, collective sigh of relief, and then suddenly went, oh, hang on a minute, we're playtesting. But that's the point. That's the spirit of what it is. It's much easier to plan in RE2 and RE3. Okay, so our tension cards are going down. We have 3 or 4 cards left. Okay, cool. So you need to go over to that typewriter over there, or plan ahead for this. RE1, that doesn't always happen, but a lot of the game is exploring. A lot of the game is exactly like Resident Evil video games are. You don't know what's around the next corner, and we give you objectives. I mean, this game is very much typified by we tell you how to complete it, i.e. what your scenario objectives are. Yeah. We don't tell you how to achieve that. We don't say, for example, I know what say you need to get the item C card. What we don't tell you is actually you need to go and find the emblem key, which you use that to go get the armor key, that then lets you open the door, that then lets you go and use the piano puzzle. Once you've done that, it opens out the wooden crest, and then you can go take that, change for the gold crest, and then you get the item C. We don't tell you all the puzzle stuff to go with it, because that's part of what Resident Evil is. It's a very experiential type of game. You have to explore, you have to see what's there, and that permeates all the way down from the way the decks evolve, to the story decisions you make, to the way that the game actually develops, gives you narrative events and so on. It's very much more integrated.
How do you work with the kind of the puzzle elements then? Because I can imagine it would be just find this card, go to this card, and go to this card. But do you have to be a bit more inventive to make it actually act like a puzzle then?
So some of it is that, exactly what you've said. Fetch quest feels like a slightly derogatory term to it, but a lot of it is to find item, take it to this location, and obviously the item random, and the mystery there comes from the fact that the locations of different items are randomized, and then obviously you don't know where you've actually got to get it to until you explore the map. But there's a lot of other ones. Resident Evil 1 is different to the other two games in that it introduces a puzzle deck. And we use that. I don't think there's ever two puzzles that are the same. We have several scenarios that have very unique puzzles, whether that's one that comes to mind is where you start off all those puzzle cards to face down, and you have to spend actions to flip over set puzzles, and the objective is to get all of the cards face up.
Mm-hmm.
And you can spend an action to flip over cards 1 and 3, for example, or 1 and 4, and then it gives you different combinations you can do of flipping over cards. So one player is doing that while everyone else is playing.
Oh, right. Okay.
There's other ones where it's a case of you have a set combination of these cards. So imagine you deal 3 cards face down. There's 4 cards with different symbols on them. You deal 3 cards face down. You've got switches for all of these different cards dotted around. You have to hit the correct switches to be able to flip up some of these cards. But if you push the one that isn't there, then it resets the puzzle, and then you have to start all over again. There's a variety of different puzzles that we introduced into that, which it's a lot of fun to make them, to be honest. Sort of spent several days with Steve just sitting down and blasting through and sort of saying, how do we create puzzles that are intuitive in the sense that you spend an action to interact with it in some way?
Yeah. That
aren't something where once you know the combination or know what to do, you can then just brute force it very quickly.
Yeah.
But at the same, or just have muscle memory and just go up and go, okay, so I push A, B, C, and then it's done.
Yeah.
And then the other one is, of course, something which doesn't slow everyone down to a grind. Like, it is something where, because the worst thing in a lot of games is where you get to a certain point, it's like, right, what's this puzzle? Everyone stops playing the game and everyone starts sitting there going, how do we resolve this? And then, half hour later, someone goes, I know the solution. Now we can go back to running around away from zombies. We wanted to create puzzles that would play in the background while everyone else is running around trying to escape from different enemies.
And I'm always surprised that more kind of games of this genre don't have puzzles. I mean, as in, they'll have kind of like fetch quests that you say. But it's very rare that, and I'm talking about whatever dungeon crawler you're talking about, whatever zombie game you're talking about, there's not one that says, okay, in order to get this, you've got to actually figure out this puzzle. And I don't know if it's just there's so much expectation in this genre of game that if you started throwing some really cerebral stuff at folk, people would kind of bounce off it. But
it's really interesting. I think I remember looking at RE2 and RE3 very much, and because the subject of puzzles came up.
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously a big part of the DNA for what Resident Evil games are, certainly the early ones. And for Resident Evil 2, I looked at the video game itself, and as much as it has a reputation for having lots of puzzles in there, most of them are fetch quests.
Yeah.
It's go get item A, take it to location B, and then the thing is then done. There are a couple of exceptions, but largely that's what it is. RE3 is very much similar. There are a few more puzzles in it, but at the same time, it didn't, again, because RE3 tends to be more action orientated, there's more enemies and you've got more damage output. That was kind of something slightly against the way of the spirit of the game.
Yeah.
So we put a lot of the puzzles in that we made into narrative events to resolve them that way. In the case of RE1, puzzles are a much larger part of what that game is. So we wanted to address that properly and actually put them in a sensible fashion. And I'll admit, initially that's quite an intimidating thought, because it is, how do you do this, or how do you do this in a way that, as I've said, doesn't bog down gameplay, keeps people at the table and keeps them engaged, keeps the action moving and so on. What I found actually working on it was there actually, once we started doing it, it wasn't actually as hard as I thought it would be. It was something that was actually, once we worked out the rules on how to do this, it was actually okay. It was something where it did exactly what you'd expect, which is it kept players actually trying to go, how do I do this thing? And then as long as you don't break your action economy to stop it from, to make it happen, as long as there isn't that bit where everything slows to a halt and everyone's standing there scratching their heads, as long as you keep the action economy going and it feels like what you're doing is part of the actual, fits within the objective system, fits within your characters moving around, and it's not just, I'm looking at that puzzle track to try and work out the answer. I'm also looking at the playing space. I'm moving my characters around in that area to go, as I said, activate a switch or to, click a door to actually reveal a card or whatever else. As long as there's interactivity between the two, keeps it going, keeps it flowing.
And also there's the tension side of things as well, because one of the things that Resident Evil was famous for, if you say to people Resident Evil, they're all going to say the same thing, which is the dog coming through the window. And they're also going to say the famous kind of, when you first find your first zombie and they turn round ominously, which is interesting. Part of the box when you open it, it's got this delightful kind of, one of those kind of concertina puzzles that you used to get, that as you flip it slightly, it kind of changes the kind of the picture that was kind of there. But in terms of like the tension side of things, Resident Evil 3, the tension, I felt the tension worked really, really well, because the zombies weren't aggressive. It wasn't like you were fighting in another dungeon crawler where they were moving kind of like everything's moving 3 or 4 spaces and things like that. They just they shambled a space and that was it. They were this kind of constant threat. So with Resident Evil 1, the number of threats in the video game was obviously a lot less. So did you then have to take that into consideration when it came to kind of like the tension side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things we always wanted to do with every Resident Evil game was one of the challenges we always had was every enemy in Resident Evil presents a challenge. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a lowly zombie, it's a dog jumping through a window, a hunter or a licker, or the tyrant itself. We never wanted it to be as simple as run up to that enemy, boom, 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 roll some dice, it goes away, we don't care. Yeah. It has to feel like there's a pressure there. That's why the zombies are the way they are in Resident Evil games. They force players to... Every enemy is a talking point. Every enemy is, well, I could try and put it down, but that'll take some ammunition. Yeah. I don't have a lot of ammunition. So, am I going to come back into this room? Am I not going to come into this room? Yeah. And so on. And effectively what you're juggling there is 3 different resources. One is time, one is ammunition, and the other one is health. Yeah. And depending on which one of those you are poor at, because you will never have all of them as really, really good, then at that point that makes your decision for you, is a big part of your reasoning behind what you're doing. And that has always served us very, very well as a formula, going through all the way from 2 through to 3 and then back to 1 again, because that resource management is at the very heart of Resident Evil's engine, and it's always been that way, and that taps into it in a way which makes players really resonates with players. That's what makes players feel like this is a Resident Evil game. It's sticking into that core DNA. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we didn't necessarily have to make too many changes to RE1. Now, obviously, there are more enemies in RE3 because that's what the game is.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
Resident Evil 1, what we wanted to do there was create more effects that mean the zombies have more presence or are more threat or more dangerous. We want our environments to feel more claustrophobic. Yeah. We want it to be something where not shutting a door is literally death, because that means suddenly lots of things come up and grab you. Like, we wanted to have more archways, so you feel like even though there's only 1 or 2 enemies, you can't get away from them so easily because the corridors are much bigger. Yeah. Make the area feel more enclosed and more inescapable. Like, there are lots of areas in Resident Evil 1 where it's like I don't want to go back there. I really, really don't want to go back to that corridor because it was really dicey and grim, but the game is forcing me to have to go back that way because that's where the objective is, or that's the way I've got to backtrack through the level.
In that respect, does the game, because it says it's like up to, I think it's 1 to 4 players, so because of the nature of the original Resident Evil game, I'm guessing that this is a kind of it is like literally a game that was probably designed with a lot more kind of solo play in mind, not by merely by following what the game does itself, the video game kind of format. So in that case, you get the kind of the same tension, you get the kind of the same, I guess, continual threat from the zombies as well. So because there is a tendency nowadays to kind of make board games and then to slot on some kind of solo mode that is either something that beats points or is a very, very convoluted way of having like a second or third player play along kind of side you. And some of them are done exceptionally well, and some of them you feel like it's actually easier to double hand a character than actually use the kind of the solo rules that they kind of have. So, I mean, does it in that, as I was saying, do you think it kind of warrants kind of like, it's really, really a good game for solo players? I mean, somebody that's playing this by themselves is going to have just as a good time if they're sitting around the table with like 3 or 4 other people.
Resident Evil, it's interesting because we've always been served very well by Resident Evil, because ultimately at core level, you can change the number of players very easily, and the game actually adapts around you.
Yeah.
And the way I say that is because of the tension deck. That's the secret sauce here. The tension deck maintains that you will get the same amount of actions, the same amount of turns. Doesn't matter whether you're playing solo, whether you're playing 4 players. The tension deck is exactly the same. The only variable is that for 4 players, we do increase it so that you can refresh it in extra time.
Yeah.
And that's purely to represent this idea that for 4 players, it's a bit too tight to complete some of the objectives because of where players can end up.
Yeah.
And chances are, a lot of the time, you actually don't need that second inquiry with them. That's more of a ripcord if you need it kind of thing. And also lets players play the way they want to play. Now, what's nice, so in that sense, the amount of enemies is exactly the same. The amount of, yes, your ammunition goes up a little bit, but not in a dramatic sense. It's only a starting handgun. That's all it is. And that's not, that's nowhere near as dramatic as you might think in Resident Evil, because it does take a lot of bullets to put down a zombie. It forces you to make slightly different decisions as you go. And as a result, solo mode actually just seems to quite smoothly play through. It doesn't matter how many players you pick.
Yeah.
It can be easier to play with 2 characters, but that's more from what I've seen of thematic representation. We do a lot in Resident Evil to make sure players, characters feel isolated from each other. We deliberately have multiple starting areas because we don't want characters to be running around together. Because again, it's part of the core DNA for Resident Evil.
Yeah, just gung-ho in it, basically.
Yeah. It's you are out on your own. That's part of that sense of isolation, and I'm looking for a friend is kind of what Resident Evil games are.
Yeah.
If you think about most Resident Evil video games, most of the time the character is running around trying to survive, holding their breath the entire time, going, I need to find out someone. As soon as you find somebody else, there's a cutscene and you go and just relax back into your seat and enjoy what's happening because you're safe.
Yeah.
For however long that lasts, you're going to be safe for a little bit while they're talking. And then typically that's where the character runs off and you go, no, don't go.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to go back to running around on my own again. And that's what those are the things we emulate, but they all serve us very well when it comes to solo play.
With it being such an iconic game then, did you look at kind of adding in like little Easter eggs, little homages to the game as kind of people were playing it so that the fans would notice it and go, oh, yeah, okay.
I mean, yes. Is the answer. Like, I regularly get a whole, like, ever since we made RE2, we get a whole bunch of praise for that. Exactly that.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things I've always strived for with Resident Evil especially is to make sure that, all the nods are in there that as a Resident Evil superfan, I would expect to see myself. So, half our narrative cards are quotes from characters in the game, for example. Yeah. Here's a small example of some of the stuff we do with this, for example. So you may or may not be aware, we have something called a retro pack for each of the 3 first games, where like it's obviously we have our board game design for what our card backs and our card fronts and everything else are. Yeah. We also have done retro packs where the graphics on them are pixelated like the old PlayStations, and then the actual menu and the actual card format is like the old menu screen, so it's the old blue colours and so on. Yeah. So if you want to play in a retro way, you can do. And for the retro pack for RE2, so if you go to Wesker's desk in the video game and you search it 50 times, the 51st time you find it, you'll find a picture of one of the rookie STARS members. Now, for our retro pack, we put the 51st item card in there. We added a whole extra card, which is that picture of that STARS member. It has no in-game purpose whatsoever. Yeah. But the idea is you search the item deck 50 times. The 51st one you pull out is this picture to give you ideas of the Easter eggs and so on.
That's kind of cool. That kind of goes over and above. There's game. I don't know. I always appreciate when people kind of put these little kind of Easter eggs into their games. I think the first time I was kind of like, oh, that's cool, was when I was playing. I think it was King Domino. And you play King Domino and you're laying the tiles down. You go, oh, it's Wheatfield, but then you go, oh, look, it's there's a scarecrow there, or look, there's somebody that looks like Loch Ness. It's like looks like Nessie there, and or a cauldron, or a knight, or a dragon, or whatever, and it all just continues to kind of like have these kind of like little Easter eggs. I'm assuming then that the next big behemoth you might be looking at is probably one that might get, will get a lot of little hearts aflutter, which is number 4.
Well, we kind of already announced it, so at this point we can totally talk about that. Yeah, it is RE4.
So in terms of that, because that is, Resident Evil 4, that came into like its own, and it was very much a kind of an actiony type affair. There was kind of little puzzles and stuff like that involved. I'm just hoping that we do have a card that just says "What you buying" on it, because that would be magnificent to have the store.
I don't know. Why would we stop at a card?
You've got a... Yeah. Oh, okay. Have we got a little figure? Oh, please, have we got a little figure? Oh, wow. Oh, come on, don't do that. You do this all the time. It's like, oh, it may be forbidden. Right, okay, that's... Well, I'm taking that. That's a definite thing that kind of it is. But again, there's going to be... There must be a kind of a development gulf between kind of Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil, because it takes place across a much larger area. You're moving from... I would say very simple. There's no corridors and streets, so the representation of the game on tiles and stuff like that, I would assume, would be a little bit more trickier to achieve. So is it going to be a complete kind of rebuild to appreciate how that, to make sure you're showing that you understand how the original video game kind of worked, how far it expanded, that it's going to be an awful lot more kind of combat involved as well?
Yeah, Resident Evil 4 is... in a lot of ways, and I think this was really evident with the Resident Evil 4 remake. Resident Evil 4, as much as it feels immediately quite different to the traditional Resident Evil games, it is more action-oriented and so on. Actually, when you start looking at the core, what the actual core gameplay is, and this was never more evident than RE4 remake, actually, it's closer than you'd think. To what the original RE games were. Yes, it was a next generation of console, so immediately it starts to feel very different in terms of more open. But when you actually start drilling into it, once you actually play through if you were to sit there and play through the game and make a note of it, half the game roughly is actually is interiors, is rooms and corridors. The big place where Resident Evil 4 changes a lot more than... Well, 2 big places where Resident Evil 4 changes a lot more than what the traditional RE is. I say the 2 big things, I can go on for ages, but the 2 big key takeaways. One is there's a lot of combat puzzles. So you'll go into an area, you'll have a combat puzzle, and that combat puzzle might be kill the cultist that drops the particular key you need to get out. It might be survive for this much time. It might be flick these switches, whatever else. And then a lot of the corridor areas or everything else is connective tissue that simply rarely has too many enemies, if any at all, and just takes you from point A to point B. And it is more level-based, chapter-based as a result. It kind of feels a little bit more like this is this section of the game, this sort of chapter, as it were, this is this chapter, and so on. So that's a bigger change, because obviously that by nature makes it much more linear than what the traditional Resident Evil experience is. The other one is the economy of it. So Resident Evil 1 was and Resident Evil 1 through 3 was always very much, I have limited resources, limited ammo, limited healing items. That's really what I'm looking at. That's resource management I'm looking at. And I only have so many slots to carry things around, and I'm running backwards and forwards between item chests and so on. RE4 doesn't really do that as such. It's more about action economy. I'm being attacked by all of these different enemies. I need to try and, I need to switch weapons because I haven't got time to reload. I can't waste too many bullets trying to aim up too much time trying to aim attacks on this particular enemy because I might get grabbed from one side or the other.
Yeah.
It's about movement. It's about your economy, because you still do have limited healing items and limited bullets, but I don't know about a lot of people, maybe it's because I played a lot of Resident Evil, but that never felt too crushing a weight when I was playing the game. the demand was more so much, it's my economy of movement, it's my economy of action, it's as I do things in any particular given situation, I want to make sure that I have the freedom I have to move around and react to what's, to the threats that are coming towards me, or to go and achieve the different objectives and so on. That's what that's the pressure there. And I think that's one of the key jumps or changes to Resident Evil 4 from the Resident Evil engine as we know it. Because exactly as you say, it is a rebuild.
Yeah.
It is something where we aren't going to make the Resident Evil 1 system and go, well, we'll put more enemies in and now it's Resident Evil 4. That's not how that works. Yeah. We need to look at this in a different way to better emulate to better capture that game experience and for the tabletop and make it feel like exactly as we did with the others. People say, okay, this feels like a Resident Evil 4 game.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing with Resident Evil 4 was it actually moved into kind of almost human combatants as well. So you had people moving an awful lot faster. One of the things I'm going to be interested to see how you tackle is the weapon storage part, because that in itself was a huge puzzle part of the game, was kind of like deciding what weapons you were going to store, where you were going to hold them and things like that as well. So that was always a huge piece. So where are you on the timeline for Resident Evil 4? Is that going to be a crowdfunding thing, or is that going to be coming kind of like to retail?
It's Kickstarter.
Okay.
And we are on the timeline.
We're on the sacred timeline. No,
I'm not. Yeah, there'll be announcements in due course about bits and pieces.
You just like drop all this other stuff, Sherwin, right? And then when it comes to timelines, you're like, nope. I'm not saying a thing, which I understand, because crowdfunding timelines can change from kind of week to week and stuff like that as well.
It's more so much, there's ways to build things.
Yeah.
Like if I was to sit down with you and go, here's every single detail you might possibly need, then you would never get me back on, because you'd be like, well, we already told you.
Yeah, I know. You've got to kind of let us want it more. I guess my question is, are you going to do Resident Evil 5? Or are you going to skip? Skip that? Are you going to skip that?
That's a really good question that I do not know the answer to myself. So anything I say would pure speculation.
Yeah,
I could see Resident Evil 5 would be a challenge for some reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, well, we kind of did that, but then we'll do a card game, and we'll print a couple of copies for it. I don't know. I liked Red. I must admit. 5, okay. 6, okay as well. 7 was just ridiculous. And I wonder how that would transfer into kind of like a board game. I mean, out of the ones that are out just now, is there one that you're saying, I'd love to get my hands on this and start developing something like that? Or have you already done it already?
There are several Resident Evil games that I would really love to work on. So at the moment, I'm working on Resident Evil 4.
Yeah.
That's it. I would love to be working... If you gave me... you said, okay, every single Resident Evil game out there are some that I would love to work on. The two that immediately jump to mind is Resident Evil 0.
Yeah.
And Resident Evil Gaiden.
Oh, okay.
Which no one knows what Resident Evil Gaiden is, which is it came out for the Game Boy Color. And it is such a innovative game because obviously they've got severe restrictions in terms of what they actually had hardware to work with.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll do a YouTube search after this is over, but it's, for me, it's such a they were so clever with how do we recreate a Resident Evil game, but we have no capability to do this in any sort of meaningful way based on what Resident Evil existing is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the sort of thing where that's an interesting challenge to me. That's the sort of thing where I'd love to sit down and go, this is kind of fun. I've built prototypes for imagining what some of our stuff is. I've built prototypes for Resident Evils that are very different to the ones that we've released so far. Mm-hmm. Now, whether we were to grab those engines and then go running with them, whether that was something that actually we decided, do you know what, let's stick to what, to where we, to our current template and so on. There's a whole bunch of different things we can look at, because obviously we never stop thinking out loud, and our dev team, we're always thinking about different ideas of how could we approach this game. Just because we made a game this way once doesn't mean we always stick to that.
Yeah.
we always want to say what best emulates this, or what would be kind of fun. There's always academic exercises of what would this look like if it was a card game / board game / RPG / anything else.
Yeah. Going right back. Let's touch on a bit about Sea of Thieves.
Okay, sure.
Because I'll be honest with you, I'm not feeling it's getting enough love out there. So can you give us a rundown on kind of how it works? Because I don't own an Xbox, I'm a PS5 boy. So I don't think it's available on the PlayStation 5. But
it's not.
And that kind of, that makes me sad, because apparently it's very, very good. But again,
it is very, very good. I recommend it.
But in terms of the game, how have you matched the kind of the exploration piece and the battle, the skirmishing side of stuff, and how does the game, have you taken kind of main elements of the Sea of Thieves kind of experience, or what parts have you done? Because you obviously couldn't, it'd be a tricky one to take everything.
So Sea of Thieves is there's a few big takeaways that we zoomed in on, and some of them are let's go way back to a starting point, and it's almost like a design dojo kind of thing. So starting point is, okay, we're going to make a really cool really cool pirate game. So let's go with that. Yeah. Okay, so what do we think that should be part of? Well, we think we should go around on our boats, go look for treasure, go fight enemies, attack each other, kill sea monsters, go get gold, take it back, trade it, get special crew, upgrade our boats and special cannonballs and stuff. And then basically, what's our objective? Well, we'd like to get, somehow we need to say, let's say one of you gets enough reputation or infamy to become better than the others, and that's how we do it. And that was like our sort of starting point before we even necessarily went too much further. It's like, that feels like a good core game loop. Now, what's really interesting is that's literally very close to Sea of Thieves. The only part that's not necessarily Sea of Thieves is that you don't really have a time limit on that, because it's an open world pirate game.
Yeah.
So you simply just play around. So the one conceit we had to add to that is this idea of reputation. You are trying to become a pirate legend, and you do that by getting enough reputation, because otherwise our game never ends, and therefore we can't make that game. So we have to have something that does that way. But the rest of the activities I just mentioned are all in the Sea of Thieves game. And bearing in mind, this is a game where the objective can be literally to go around and do whatever you want to do, but you can go get new outfits, or which are in our game, for example. You can go upgrade your ship. You can go attack sea monsters. You can go dig for treasure. You can fight skeletons. So a lot of it was quite straightforward to map over. One of the big things we wanted to do when we, in terms of that acclimatization, to make sure it feels like the game, was to really zoom in. So what's your individual experience of playing Sea of Thieves? And one of the things that really comes out of the Sea of Thieves video game is I am a member of crew on a ship, and I'm doing stuff as well as other players. So a lot of that crew focus is where we zoomed into when it came to the design for it, which is very much what your ships do is based on the number of crew you have. Crew tasks are key to success in the Sea of Thieves game. So it is literally, are you doing the sail sort of action, which is generally to sort of the rigging and steer your ship to where you want to go before you hit full sail? Is it to revive a member of crew who's downed? Is it to bail? Is it to repair damage or whatever else? When you actually get to making, when you do open fire on things, or when you do actually do a full sail, or when you plunder stuff, you make a crew roll, and that's determined by the amount of active crew you have, and so on. All these different ideas that we wanted to put in there are really sort of zoom in on that particular experience, because that's when you actually take a step back and look at the video game. That's what you are. You are a crew member on a ship, and that's what you do. So we kind of deliver to players this sense that they're almost like the admiral of the fleet, steering their ships around and wherever they want to go and have the bigger picture, but at the same time, they are very much zoomed in to this is the crew transaction, so it feels more like Sea of Thieves.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big conceits we have. In terms of the actual way it plays, we generally tend to think of it as like a 4X Lite. So it is, it's that, but it's much more streamlined. Whereas lots of 4Xs typically have over lots and lots of overlapping systems that aren't necessarily super complicated, but there's a lot of them to kind of keep track of. Sea of Thieves has like a very simple core loop, which is your actions, and once you've got that, the rest of it is very straightforward. It's kind of more reactive. It's more like a draw a card, resolve the things on the card, and that will dictate how the enemies move or what events happen in the world. And they're actually contained in the card, so you don't have lots and lots of rules to remember. Because one of the things we wanted to do was make it feel like there's very little downtime. Players shouldn't sort of be sitting there going, well, this person's turn takes 10 minutes, so I'm going to go check on my phone and update my Facebook, or go to make a cup of tea or whatever else. We wanted to keep our action moving fast. So that's one of the big sort of conceits of what we've built.
Do you go back to games like Sea of Thieves and play them again? Are you? I mean, Absolutely. As part of like what you're doing, are you the likely to kind of like strip parts out of games to say, right, okay, this definitely works. How did this work, and understand it? And I'm not saying Control C, Control V, but it's kind of like understanding when things kind of gel together. When you've got people who haven't spent the last 6 months kind of play testing in the game and it's out there, kind of understanding what worked exceptionally well and what wasn't, or what people had issues with. Because I can imagine that there'll be stuff that you'll put out there and people go, that was amazing, that was fantastic, I loved that, and you're just like, wow, that took all of 5 minutes to put together. And then there'll be other stuff which you'll spend days kind of playtesting and make sure everything is balanced, and nobody mentions it, and you're just like, what the okay, have you people got a kind of no taste? But do you, as I said, you continually kind of go back into your back catalogue to make sure you're doing, like, I guess you would say, your CPD, your continuous professional development?
Always. Never, ever, ever want to rest on our laurels, any of the team. None of us ever rest on our laurels. Whenever we make any game, we always want to listen to our community. We want to chat to them. What did you like? Not even necessarily asking that question, just watching and looking and hanging out with them, but seeing what is it that people are really excited about. What is it that was a swing and a miss? What is it that people think could be better? What is it that people think works really, really well? All of these things factor into our approach. Think about how I talked about Resident Evil, for example, to quickly go back to there. One of the best bits of feedback that we received for example, Resident Evil 2. A lot of people said, we love this game, but the setup time is quite long.
Yes.
So, cool, no worries. So, looked at this and went, right, well, one of the problems with that is the deck. You're building a custom tension deck, a custom item A deck, a custom item B deck every single time. Yeah. So, how about we make 2 of those decks evolve? We make the tension deck, you keep one tension deck, some cards go in or some cards go out. We keep one item A deck, and that immediately means you set up that deck once and then you never need to do it again. And then for Resident Evil 1, again, it's like, how do we continue to smooth that out? So, okay, let's make it so the map explores this way or whatever else. And that's kind of it. You kind of always want to go back and look at these things. So Sea of Thieves, absolutely, I've played that since, and I've played it a few times, and I've certainly spoke to a few different people about what works well and what doesn't work well, whatever else. And this will always inform our decisions going forward. Always. It doesn't necessarily, even it could just be a simple mechanic. The catch-up mechanic, for example, in the Sea of Thieves game, is to do with how many fortune cards you get, which is roughly the amount of VP that the person, or reputation the person in first place has, versus the person in last place. There's a mechanic in it which gives you additional cards, fortune cards, which lets you do rerolls, it gives you in-game effects and various different things. You get more of them if the gap between you and the player in first place is bigger. So as a result, there's more of a catch-up built in. That seems to have really resonated with a lot of fans. Cool. It's not terribly Sea of Thieves-y. It's pure board game mechanic territory, but at the same time, that works really well. We should do that again. If we look at Bard Song, we look at, you mentioned it earlier, the solo play mechanics. We introduced what I think is very much regarded as one of the better solo implements we've ever done in that game. So that will probably be something we put into other games going forward, emulating that, what worked really, really well there. All of this stuff informs us because that's just how the world works, right?
One of the interesting things about Sea of Thieves is it doesn't have the normal selection of minis.
No. Not yet.
Oh, just dropping little breadcrumbs all the time.
I've been apparently that's why I come on this show. So just throw the stuff out.
It's like my first is in Windmill, but not in Seafall. I mean, yeah, it's kind of piqued my. I've always been looking around for kind of like a decent pirate game, and I've got Seafall in my cupboard, so I'm still looking around for a decent pirate game. I occasionally, do you know what? See if I'm ever selling any kind of old board games that I've got, I put Seafall in the picture just to kind of boost its confidence a bit, to make it think that people actually might want it. It's one of these games I'm never ever going to get rid of. I'm probably never ever going to play it. But it's like just one of these things. I've had it for so long. It's kind of like it's like a horrific duck ornament that you've got on the wall that you don't actually know where you got it from, but you don't want to get rid of it in case the person that gave you it turns up at your house for a cup of tea and wonders where the duck ornament's gone.
Or you don't want to re-gift it just in case you give it back to the person who gave it to you.
Exactly. I gave you that for kind of Christmas. What about in terms of like going forward? I mean, you've obviously got a lot of stuff kind of happening and a lot of stuff kind of going on. There's a few interesting things kind of going on at Steamforged. One of the things is that you've got yourself a little bit of Reiner in the house, which I thought was I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting. But I guess it kind of makes sense to put out kind of like an old loved kind of existing title. But in terms, but for you, and we've had this discussion away from the podcast anyway, is there like a smaller kind of card game, lighter kind of Euro, that kind of thing? Or are you kind of, would you consider doing something kind of slightly different on a kind of a smaller level, a smaller kind of game yourself, just to kind of...
100%. I always want... Yeah, I play a wide variety of different games. Unsurprisingly, I mean, and that's not exclusive me. Like the SFG team gets together quite a lot, and we all play a huge variety of different games, and it goes in swings, and as with all things, it goes in sort of cycles of what's popular amongst us or not. If I go back a few months, like a whole bunch of us are playing a whole bunch of 4Xs. If I look at it now, we're currently going through a whole bunch of miniature games. Yeah. So we all go in sort of swings and roundabouts. But yeah, I'm always very happy to look at alternatives. One of the things I've been sort of turning my hand to a little bit more of recent times is a whole bunch of writing. I'd love to be more involved with Richard working on some RPG stuff, for example, making a complete sidestep, if I can. And then I've obviously looked at I've actually built more than a few card game prototypes, bits and pieces. I mean, the Sonic card game was me. Peaky Blinders was me. Shadow Games, one of our old card games. There's a whole bunch of different bits and pieces that we've looked at. So.
Are those nice little palette cleansers then? I mean, I can imagine when you're working like on something like Elden Ring and Resident Evil and their big games, is it nice to kind of like get, here's something relatively short and sharp that I can work on and be focusing my different kind of attentions on?
I'd never describe any game as a palette cleanser because that feels slightly derogatory. I'd never want to do that. But I do understand your sense.
You know what I mean? As in kind of giving your brain something else to kind of focus on. I don't mean it in a kind of derogatory way, but I kind of a different direction. A different.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always every game is always a challenge in sense of, and very much meant in the most positive way possible. It's always an intellectual challenge to, how do I make this game the best it can be? Yeah. And completely changing medium and format is always a really short, sharp, swift change to the system straight away. Like, okay, how do I make this? And that's cool. So yeah, absolutely, it's always entertaining. One of the things I find a lot when I play any games, whether this be a video game, a board game, an RPG, whatever else, is for me trying to understand the mechanics. How does it tick? What's the engine? What's keeping this thing going? What's interesting about this, what's not interesting about this. That's what fascinates me endlessly, and switching projects to like a new medium is always entertaining for that exact reason.
Are you able to switch off though and just go ahead and enjoy something? I'll tell you the reason why, okay? When I review games, I'm playing them, but there's part of me that's always thinking at the back, does this system work? If I played it with 3 or 4 people, am I going to get the same kind of reward? If I, is the setup too long? Is the rule book just nonsense and doesn't make any sense? Or, is this all balanced out and stuff like that? And sometimes I just need to take that part of my brain away and throw it to the side and just say, look, we're playing this game so we can have some kind of fun. So when you're doing the same, do you kind of say, well, I'm going to put my developer brain on the shelf and just crack on and just have some fun with this?
Never completely. It's a bit like... So, do you know sometimes when you go to watch... when you sit down watching a movie in the cinema or something, and you are so thoroughly caught up in the movie that you kind of sit there, you watch it, and you're just taking in what's going on the screen, and you're having a great time. And then sometimes when you sit there and you watch a movie and you kind of find yourself at some point break for a second, break the immersion, look at your watch, go, oh, I've been in here for a little while, or a long while, or whatever else. I know I'm playing a good game when I don't have problem disconnecting in that way. Like, I will always have an ambient level of, what's the game mechanics on this? Because that's simply informed by the day job. That's simply informed by how I've trained myself to understand how games work. Whether it's action economy, speed bumps, whatever else, right? Any number of different bits of jargon I could throw at you for names of stuff of how we interpret things. But I find in really good games, I will just... There's a point where that kind of fades away and I'm just thoroughly caught up in the experience. Whereas on a game that perhaps might not be so strong, that's the bit where I kind of have that look at my watch moment. Yeah. And at that point, I know I'm in full game developer mode is flip back on, because my level of engagement and drive towards this thing is just not the same.
Yeah, no, I kind of find that kind of interesting. It's like, I'm obviously not a designer, but it's just turning that off and saying, that's why I sometimes play games like I've played quite a few times, because I know I can switch it off and not have to be bothering looking at it. I like jump into viticulture on a regular basis, because it's one of my favourites, and I don't, it's easy to teach, and I can just play it and kind of just enjoy it and kind of get on with it. Resident Evil board game it's out there in the wild. It's the wonderful price of $99.99, and you get a ton of minis in there. You get a lovely scenario book. You get your full kind of rule book. Is there going to be, and I know what the answer to this question is there going to be a little expansion? Is there going to be a cheeky little expansion at all to this?
I mean, you knew the answer. What's the answer?
Probably yes.
So there are, off the top of my head, there's two main expansions for it, which is Into the Darkness and Bleak Outpost. There's also a third one, which is called Director's Cut, which you can get, I think, direct from our website, probably. And that has a whole bunch of extra characters and enemies and game modes and things. So, yes.
So there you go. And obviously what we'll do is we'll make sure that we put this link into the show notes so that we've got notes to show. And then what I'll do is I'll do a Control-C, Control-V on the previous links that you gave me from previous episodes, because there's no point in searching them out. And you're in all this.
And provided they work the same way.
Well, you're all in the same place. I'm assuming.
I like the idea. You're going to say, "Hey, go check this out," and it's a link to like CFE.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the name to everything, and it's just going to be links all to Sea of Thieves. Like every single one's going to be a link to Sea of Thieves. Like that's saying like it's a bad thing. No, I'm not saying that at all. Thank you as always for spending your valuable time with this gutter snipe. Where can we find you on the internet webs very quickly if people are trying to find you?
There's an SFG Discord these days, and I'm always very active in that. I'm on BGG as well. You can also find me on Twitter or whatever that's called these days, Sherwin's Agenda. But yeah, otherwise those are the main places.
And make sure you do, especially the Discord, but also the Facebook.
Discord's really cool because and Facebook groups, you'll find me in the different groups for the various games, the Resident Evil one in particular, but Discord is really great. It's a wonderful way to interact with the audience. Wonderful way to interact with our communities and pick up ideas or just chat to them about what's cool and what they like. We ended up having a conversation about G.I. Joe last time I was on this, so it's not anything. It's not all related to work. A lot of it's just hanging out and doing stuff.
Exactly, and we all need a bit of hanging out and doing stuff at the moment, which is all good. And if you want to keep an eye on what we're up to, just go to the internet and search for We're Not Wizards, and you'll find us in all the different places where the zombies are shambling very slowly towards you. It's we'renotwizards.com for the podcast, we'renotwizards.co.uk for the blog and website. And you can find us on your podcast catcher of choice as normal. If you are going to be finding us on your podcast catcher of choice, there's a couple of things you can do. You can tell other people about us. And the other thing you can do is you can drop us a rating or a review, because that always helps get us being seen in front of everybody else. And if you are going to be giving us a rating or review, remember, don't give us 10 stars because it just makes us big-headed, but don't give us 1 star because it makes us cry. Give us something in the middle, like a 5, because it's average. But the person who's not being average is rather wonderful, rather fantastic. He's the Resident Evil. It's Mr. Sherwin Matthews. There you go. Thanks for getting.
It's the best outro I've ever had.
That just goes to show the level of outros that you get. So, and there's only one more thing to do. It's a goodbye from Sherwin. Say goodbye, Sherwin.
Yes.
And it's a goodbye from me. Remember, stay safe, roll 6s, make something awful, and watch out for those windows because the dogs are going to be coming through.
Do we not do the whole "we're not wizards" thing?
I did.
What you did do?
Yeah.
I missed that.
Oh. I don't know.
I thought you normally say we're not.
We're many things, but we're not wizards. Are we wizards, Sherwin?
No, we're necromancers.
No, see, that's why I didn't do it, because you're going to drop in something else. You know, that's why I didn't do it. Because it's like, oh, is he going to come up with something clever? Oh, he's a necromancer. That means you muck about with the dead. That's not very nice.
Okay, I'll be an umbrella researcher.
Well, that also means that you muck around with the dead, which is also not very nice.
I'm being on brand.
I'm being Jill Valentine, which also means you're not muck around with the dead. But until then...
Yeah, exactly.
Until the next time, zombie boy. Goodbye.
A wizard is never late. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.